All right, let's jump right in. Today we're tackling a huge topic, immigration, but we're looking at it from a totally different perspective, a theological one. We're going to break down a specific framework that builds a case for national identity and responsibility, and it's all based on a core set of religious principles.
So right out of the gate, the source material hits us with this really powerful idea. The whole argument is that if you believe a divine authority extends over all of life, then it has to apply to how we think about nations, borders, and laws. It's a completely different starting line for a debate we're all used to hearing.
So here's the plan. We'll start with that theological foundation. Then we'll move into a principle called ordered love. We'll explore the idea that nations have a divine design, and then we'll see how all of that applies to immigration and the government's role. Okay. First up, the absolute foundation of this entire framework. This is the bedrock for everything else we're going to talk about. The idea that Christ's authority is comprehensive, meaning it covers every single part of human life, including politics and our laws.
You see, this view just tears down those walls we often put up between our sacred and secular lives. The source argues that, look, if something as simple as eating and drinking can be for God's glory, then something as huge as national policy definitely is. There's just no box you can label secular where these principles don't apply.
And the philosophical idea this framework is pushing back on is called dualism. You know, this tendency to split life into two separate domains, the sacred stuff like church and the secular stuff like government or your job. This paper basically says, nope, that's a false division. It's all spiritual.
And just to show that this isn't some brand new idea, the source points way back to historical examples like the Black Robe Regiment. These were pastors back in America's founding era who were deeply involved in politics and civil matters because they believed their faith demanded it.
So if all of life is under divine authority, how are we supposed to direct our love and our responsibilities? Well, that question brings us to our second big idea, and it's a crucial principle that this framework calls the order of loves.
Ordo amoris. It's a Latin term, and it is absolutely central to this whole argument. It means order of loves, and the concept is that love isn't just this vague, universal feeling. Instead, it's an ordered set of priorities. The argument goes that we have different levels of responsibility to different people, all based on our relationship to them.
And you can see that order right here. According to the source, the hierarchy is pretty clear. Your responsibility starts with God, then it extends out to your immediate family, then to your church community, and from there to your fellow citizens. It's kind of like a ripple effect, starting with those closest to you and moving outwards.
So here's the kicker. This framework says that loving your nation, patriotism, isn't some form of sinful pride or nationalism. Instead, it's a moral duty. It's seen as a natural, responsible extension of that ordered love that begins with your own family and community.
Which leads to the next big question. If nations are a valid thing to direct our ordered love towards, where did they even come from? Well, this paper argues that distinct nations aren't just some random accident of history, but are actually part of a divine plan.
The source actually traces this whole idea back to the book of Genesis. It points to God first giving civil authority to humanity, and then later scattering people at the Tower of Babel, which created all these different language groups. And finally, it highlights how the Bible describes nations as being defined by their lands, their languages, and their family groups. It uses this narrative to argue that nations have a divine origin. So, according to this framework, a nation is a very specific thing. It's not just a place on a map. It includes defined borders, a distinct people, a shared language and culture, and a common system of laws and government. It's this whole package.
Okay, so we've laid all this theological groundwork, right? The Lordship of Christ, this idea of ordered love, the divine design of nations. So how does any of this actually apply to the modern, real-world issue of immigration? Let's dive into that.
The source makes a really sharp distinction between two different models here. On one side, you've got the lawful, assimilating resident. The biblical figure of Ruth is held up as the perfect example. Someone who says, your people will be my people. This person should be treated justly, but they also have to obey the nation's laws. But on the other side, the framework argues strongly against what it calls unrestricted migration, which it sees as a genuine threat to a nation's identity and cohesion.
And the paper gets really specific about what it sees as the consequences of hiring people who are in the country illegally. It lists economic impacts, like lower wages for citizens and a strain on welfare systems, but also cultural ones, like making assimilation much more difficult. The core concern here is about systemic justice and the overall health of the nation.
And that brings us to the final piece of this puzzle. What is the government's role in all this? If laws exist, And if nations are part of a divine design, what is the government's moral responsibility here?
The argument leans really heavily on the New Testament, specifically a passage in Romans 13. This is interpreted as God delegating authority to the civil government to be his minister, to maintain order, enforce the laws, and punish wrongdoing. So in this view, that authority isn't just man-made, it's actually God-given.
Now this is a really fascinating point that comes from the sources appendix. It draws a super clear line between an unjust law and a good law that's simply being ignored. If a law is unjust, the paper says, hey, the legislature needs to change it. But if a law is perfectly valid and just isn't being enforced, well then restoring enforcement isn't some new punishment, it's presented as a moral and constitutional duty.
And this really gets to the heart of the moral calculation here. The paper totally acknowledges that enforcing laws can be difficult, even painful. But it argues that the alternative, just failing to enforce the law, is actually a greater injustice, because it erodes the entire system of lawful order itself.
This quote just ties it all together perfectly, doesn't it? It hits on all the core pillars we've just walked through. The idea that nations are intentional, that our love and our loyalties have a proper order, and that our main responsibilities start right here, close to home.
And that's where we'll leave it, because ultimately, this framework completely reframes the debate around these really big, foundational questions. It pushes past the day-to-day policy fights and asks us to think about, what is a nation even for? Is its identity something worth preserving? And does the continuity of that nation from one generation to the next even matter? It's a very different way to approach the whole topic. Thanks for tuning in.